And welcome to another discussion with myself, Mark Vernon, and Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert.
Hi there, Mark. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. And I don't know, this is maybe the fifth or anyway, we've been having a few conversations now about various facets of life from a psychotherapeutic angle, and thinking about this in the context of sort of good therapy, bad therapy, in our therapy culture. And I wondered today whether we might return to love from a slightly different angle, and think about maybe the developmental side or the notions caught up in attachment theory, the sort of love that people have in their lives every day, for another person, and how psychotherapy has thought about that. I'm involved in a project looking at love, not actually just personal love, or relational love, but even love as it manifests in social, civic, spiritual ways, even. And so, something I've been thinking about, and wondered whether teasing out a few ideas would be of use to others as well.
Yeah, no, very good. And we said, because we've spoken a bit about narcissism before, and we've spoken a bit about the idea of falling in love with your therapist. So I thought today we'd stick a little bit more with something maybe a bit more conventional, which is the idea of love for the other and the other person. And we said maybe we could kick it off talking about attachment theory because that has a developmental angle to it. You probably know a lot more about it than I do, Mark, but I think of the work of John Bowlby in relation to attachment theory. I think he's still considered the guru, is he not?
Yeah, and there's the John Bowlby Centre here in London, championing it. It's become, I think, so central in many psychotherapeutic approaches, partly because it's got great use, which we can talk about, but also because it makes predictions that then you can gather evidence for. And psychotherapy always has this kind of ambivalent relationship to evidence, and so a theory that shows how evidence can be gathered, is always appealing. In a
Yeah.
world that demands evidence. Yeah, so no, but attachment theory is certainly a good way in.
Yeah, so maybe we can talk about that. And I always put that work a bit together with Winnicott. So, for example, Bowlby talks about secure attachment and insecure attachment when we're young. So an infant that's overly needy of their mother, or indeed vice versa for that matter, versus an infant who successfully makes a transition away from that neediness. And why I bring in Winnicott there is because often there's a transitional object involved, like the infant is given a teddy bear or a bunny or something to substitute for the mother or guardian, in order to smooth the transition from one attachment to another, or from attachment through separation anxiety, to another kind of attachment with this transitional object, the little teddy bear, for example. So yeah, I often think of Bowlby and Winnicott together when I'm putting these thoughts together.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a link. I think they were quite contemporary, so they certainly knew of each other's work for one thing. Um, Maybe should I just give a brief
Yeah,
sort of
go for it.
sketch of this idea of attachment theory? Broadly, the idea is that attachment patterns are laid down in the early part of life, depending in large part at least on the first attachment, as you're saying there, and with the parent, with the mother, and that attachment style then is inclined to shape successive attachments that the person might have, particularly in adult life. And Bowlby, he did broadly two kinds of experiment, I think. One was actually just showing that emotional attachment matters to human beings more than, say, material attachments. So you might think that what mattered most to the young child was its material needs being met, to feel warm, to feel fed, and that kind of very physical, embodied side of life. And what Bowlby showed, actually through rather distressing experiments with animals that you can find on YouTube now, is that if you deprive, say, an intelligent monkey, of well, you give it a choice. It can either satisfy its material needs or its emotional needs, broadly speaking, by being in a cage and sort of going for a teat that will feed it milk, or an artificial mother wrapped in terylene blanket, that's very comfy. It will spend a lot more time satisfying its emotional needs than it would its material needs. and then you can, do experiments that remove one or the other, and then watch how much distress the poor creature experiences. And this was quite revolutionary at the time. This is in the era of behavioral psychology, where the sort of assumption in a way is we're much more materially, even mechanically driven, instinctually driven. And so this sense of relationship mattering and emotion, and that much more felt loving kind of attachment, caused quite a stir. But then what happened is that these attachment styles, which could, of course, be observed in adult life, by taking long histories, case studies of the person's life, you could see that these patterns were laid down early in life. And broadly speaking, there are sort of four types of attachment: the secure attachment, the one that we all hope to have at least most of the time. And the point about a secure attachment is not that it needs to know of its attachment with the beloved other all the time, but rather that background sense of connection has become part of the air, the emotional air that the individual breathes. And so that means actually they're much more able to experiment and to be curious and to take risks and so on in life. The analogy with the young life is often the child who maybe in the park, will sort of run off to investigate the swing and will occasionally look back just to check that the parent's there, but is free to investigate. Whereas the less secure attachment styles, the child doesn't do that. And they're often categorized now as a kind of attachment style that is too clingy, or an attachment style that pretends it doesn't care, and sort of denies there's any attachment at all. And then a chaotic attachment style, which is just sort of all over the place. It can be useful as a sort of, at least a sketch. If someone particularly comes and is talking about relationship difficulties, to ask, is there an attachment style here that's dominating, and might that be worth investigating? It'll tell us something, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on. No, super helpful, Mark. And I like what you say there about the idea of it getting played out successively over time. So there's a kind of representation of the earlier attachment when we repeat patterns in later relationships from earlier ones, for example. It also makes me think there are symbolic ways of playing out those attachments. Freud a couple of times writes about observing his grandson Ernst playing this game where he rolls away a kind of spool. I picture it like a kind of spool of cotton or like a ball of wool or something. He kind of rolls it away and then brings it back. And when the spool is rolled away, of course, this is all in German, the boy shouts "fort," which means away or gone. And when he pulls it back, he shouts out "da," meaning it's there, it's back. And of course, Freud interprets this as the boy's coming to terms with his mother leaving and returning, particularly when she goes out shopping or something or other, and returns to the home. So there's something, in other words, the attachment style is, really patterns not just how we might behave in later life, but actually might force us to reproduce it symbolically again and again, because we're trying to figure it out somehow. There's something quite profound going on for us in that, perhaps.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's part of the link to Winnicott and transitional objects, because for Winnicott, the transitional object for the individual concerned is a kind of sacred space even. And so he makes these observations that the parent will know that, if the child has a favorite toy or a bit of sheet or whatever it might be, the parent mustn't intervene in the toy, in the transitional object. If the parent decides that it's a bit dirty and so needs a good clean, that can be really upsetting for the child. And that's Winnicott's idea, is that the object becomes an inner space where the child is negotiating its relationship to the wider world, and needs that sort of special place to do that for itself, because that's primarily the task that the child's undergoing. And so if a parent intrudes on that space, it feels invasive or threatening in some way or other. So then the transitional object is the kind of in-between zone where attachment to life is worked out.
Yeah. I mean, it's just to point out the obvious. We said we'd begin talking about love, and we've gone straight in to talk about attachment and separation. Of course, it's not a given that love is about attachment. That is a frame that's given us through Bowlby and Winnicott and others, but it's not the only one by any means. I was thinking, having mentioned Freud there, Freud has obviously very complex views about what love is, and early on there is that notion of attachment, but he doesn't really describe it like that. He describes it much more in terms of the idealization of the person. So with the child and the mother in particular, and in fact, he refers a bit to narcissism and the notion of the ego ideal and all of these quite technical terms. So what happens in the attachment is not just I attach to you, but I attach to you because there's something about you, whether you're a mother or a teddy bear, or in later life, a love partner, that is somehow a solution. It's a solution because it's better than what's available in the real world or what reality seems to present to us. So love, and of course, Freud is pretty cynical about the whole thing. So love, he ends up describing as an over-idealization of the object, as he calls it. So yes, it's attachment, but it's attachment plus elevation. It's and as you say, those transitional objects can be. I mean, I've had 3 daughters, all of whom had their own transitional object, which became, and certainly in one case, an essential part of the family. And the idea of leaving that object aside was, as you say, quite traumatic. So it's attachment plus idealization or space of fantasy, perhaps.
Yeah, and I guess that in the Lacanian world, that notion really gets picked up. Lacan puts it more slickly than this, but essentially, the definition of love is something like giving what you can't give and receiving what you can't receive, because of that idealization. Love is trying to reach out for the real, which in Lacan is an ideal zone, if you like. You know this well better than me, but it's roughly that kind of idea, isn't it?
It is, and it reminds you and I were involved in an event yesterday, in fact, about love and design. But in one of the opening presentations, we were reminded of Kierkegaard's notion of love as an infinite debt, which connects to that Lacanian idea that you can never quite fill it out. There's something always which exceeds the relationship, which stimulates desire in turn. So, I think actually in Lacan, love and desire are almost inseparable.
I myself incline to a more, I don't know, realist notion in the usual sense. Or, actually, I think it's the way that psychotherapy links to romantic traditions as well. I think Winnicott's actually a great English romantic thinker, as well as psychiatrist and everything else. And the way I'm inclined to go more is that, sure, we do these projections, we do these idealizations, but at some point they either do or don't meet reality. They do or don't connect with another person. And so the person that lived continually in the ideal, never really quite been able to give what they wanted to give, or never really quite been able to receive what they wanted to receive. That would be it's quite a desperate solipsistic state of affairs. So sometimes put, we all build castles in the air, but the risk comes when you try to move into them. And so I'm with Winnicott more, who felt that, sure, we do all this projecting and idealizing, but every so often, or maybe quite often, one actually connects with reality and so speaks back to us of the way things are, other people actually are. And then there's a second negotiation which goes on about aligning to what shows up in reality. And so real connections are made. Love is possible, and indeed, is vital in life. But it's not this idealized form of loving. It's actually the business of, in a way, the ego, you might say, finding an accommodation with another person, which is a sort of letting go, but in the letting go, through the crisis of that, a richer experience of love is found, because now there's 2 people involved, or 3 or 4, and so that's an expansion actually of this felt loving connection with reality. And so it wins out. The loss of the ideal wins out because love is bigger than the ideal even could imagine.
I'm far from being anything close to being a scientist, but I do remember reading about the cognitive and kind of neuroscientific effects of love particularly in the early phases, because of well, this happens especially between mother and baby, but also in kind of romantic infatuation style relationships where there's a kind of excess of oxytocin and probably other things like dopamine and serotonin, all those things that get a bit mixed up, certainly in my head. And I think what you say there, Mark, is helpful because I think the idealizing love is sort of connoted a bit with that chemical hit, which of course wears off over time. And then the question is, well, what replaces that? Once you've got over the quote unquote honeymoon period, are you then brought back down to earth with a crash, where the reality principle, as Freud would say, starts to dominate the pleasure principle? Or, as you're implying, which I really like, can you actually find your way through to a third position, which isn't, contained by either pleasure or reality, because they seem in a sense too unsubtle for what you described there as the kind of expansiveness, which I like a lot, actually. And maybe that's where the relationship becomes, I'm improvising here, but that's the relationship itself becomes an object, to use Freud's word, for both parties to then develop, or, as though they're collaborating in some artwork together.
Yeah, I mean, and that rings true because there is this move from falling in love to, as Eric Fromm put it, standing in love.
Yeah.
But then the standing in love, I think, does become a sort of third thing. It's which both parties, or maybe more parties, get drawn towards that which is part of themselves but also exceeds themselves, and this is why families have a sort of family culture, or why even in the constellations work, which you do, I do, things get passed down in a kind of field of love that is bigger than any one individual, even though all the individuals participate in it. And yeah, so yeah, I think that love must actually be bigger than any individual, that sharing in the love, which is why it's so important, why it sort of promises everything and takes us through everything as well.
Yeah, it makes me want to both expand on your point, Mark, and also bring again Freud back in, because I've been thinking about him a lot recently, again with a kind of very dour view of love, I think, probably. So just to expand what you said there, I listened the other day to a talk by David Lynch, the film director, who is known for his, he does transcendental meditation. And there's a talk he was giving, I think he was receiving an honorary doctorate, but he began to wax lyrical about his experience of meditation. And I won't be able to recreate what he said, but essentially he was saying that through things like transcendental meditation, you might say, Mark, perhaps through things like prayer even, one can access, I mean, you called it the loving field, but some deeper structure of the universe, clearly I'm improvising here, whose the character of which seems to be benign rather than malign, seems to be open and welcoming rather than hostile and inimical. And were it to lend itself to description, might be described as a sphere of love, or the potential for the expansion of love among humans, as though the offer is always there. We just have to kind of fill into it, I suppose. So that's kind of picking up on your thought there, that in a way, when we as humans experience human love, it's really just a tiny little microcosm of that much more macrocosmic force, wherever it exists, up there, down there, beneath us, or so I'm very interested in that, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. But just to again put the sort of horrible sort of Freudian view, really, and I'm a big fan of Freud, as you know, but he sort of says what goes on in this idealization of the other is what he calls cathexis, not his word, not a German word. The German word is Besetzung, investment. Like you put your eggs in the basket of another person. Melanie Klein has something similar, I think, when she talks about the origins of envy and hatred. because I give you this precious stuff of mine to look after. And if you ever for a second dare to look away or not treat it with the respect and reverence which I gave it, then immediately I'm ready to judge you and castigate you and walk away. I'd rather take all my eggs back than trust you with them again. So you're completely different views there of what love might be.
Yeah. I mean, I think underneath it is the question of what is it to be a human being? And to simplify massively, do you imagine the human person to be a kind of isolated individual with a psyche that sort of bumps up against other psyches, is deeply influenced and formed by other psyches, but has a kind of autonomy of its own? Or do you see us as much more porous and actually the fulfillment of our, strangely or paradoxically, the fulfillment of our individuality is actually in the sense of connection. We, I am because we are, or something like that, a much more, again, I think in the Western tradition, a much more romantic sense of things. But yeah, so sometimes, an argument might be put that these little annoyances build up in a relationship because you're constantly, even if you're the best partner in the world, just by the fact that you are separate and you do have other interests, offending the love that's being given to you. And it'll show up in little ways, the annoyance over the way you fill up the dishwasher, or suddenly you realize you haven't had sex for a couple of months, and you wonder quite what's going on. People do say that from time to time. As always with these ways of trying to talk about inner life, I think there's always something in them. They're models, and there might well be parts of a relationship, or for some people, a whole relationship that is shaped in that way. But the reason why I got onto this, as we'd be mentioning this sort of field of love idea, and was actually I wrote a book called Love All That Matters. And it was partly based on developmental psychology and the idea that we discover more and more expansive forms of love through the crises of love that inevitably we go through in our development. And so, roughly speaking, if, say, we're born feeling that everything is one, partly because we haven't yet got the sense of ourselves as separate, that gets challenged at some point, and then we realize that actually there's myself and probably in the first instance another. You mentioned our mutual friend Nicola Dunn, who sometimes says that the first person we fall in love with is our mother, is the parent. So now there's two, and it's a crisis. The child definitely will go through a phase where it refuses to receive the comfort that this other person is offering it, because of the offense of it being another person. But nonetheless, if that crisis can be navigated, then the field of love has expanded. It's now, you might say, two-dimensional. And then I think it can go three-dimensional when it's realized that this other isn't just interested in you, the young child, but has other love interests, maybe other people, a partner, other children, maybe work. And so, again, there's a crisis, and sibling rivalry and whatever it might kick off. But nonetheless, if that crisis can be born, love grows. And I think what happens is that as this pattern sort of repeats, gradually the awareness arises that there's always a bigger love that meets you on the other side of the crisis, that pre-existed your crisis and pre-existed your awareness of it, and yet shows up if you can find a way through the crisis. And how you navigate the crisis will depend very largely on how previous crises have gone. But this, for me, then connects the developmental psychology with the broad spiritual tradition, which is that the lessening of the concerns of the self reveals a wider love, a wider concern, that is the fullest satisfaction of the concerns of the self, partly because it's the most expansive appreciation of awareness, but also because in a way, the notion of the self reverses. So rather than it being seen, as maybe in Freud and others, as primarily the possession of the individual, actually it's realized that the individual self is but a reflection of this wider self, which is a kind of unity, and a unity that does manifest maybe in many ways, but certainly in loving ways. And, you know, so the connection to various theistic notions of God
Mm.
is obvious as well. So
Mm.
that's the sort of picture which I think, you know, you can build up. It makes sort of inferential sense. But you can also always make the Freudian turn, you know,
Yeah,
another one he does, and say, well, actually, it's just all regressive. It's just all a longing to get back to that Aboriginal
yeah.
unity.
Yes, or and Freud goes even further back, longing to get back to the origin and the pre-origin of the species ultimately. But I wonder if what you said there, I'm sure you know this classic model between that contrasts scarcity mindset with abundance mindset. I'm sure you've come across that in some format, but I think it maps on a little bit to what you just said there. I mean, what you said is much broader, really. But I think there is a notion, perhaps among people with insecure attachments, to go back to our opening theme, there is an anxiety there that love is finite. You know, there's only so much of it. So if I see my, you know, mentioned sibling rivalry, if I see my sibling, you know, getting a bigger portion of chips than I get at dinner, then I think, okay, well, that is a kind of representation of love. There's only so many chips to go around, and they've got more than I have. So we then develop a notion of a kind of economy of love, you know. So I have to get a bit more, and somebody gets a bit less. It's a kind of zero sum game, really, as though love isn't really love, but a value. It's been mistaken, although it's valuable. It's been mistaken for having a fixed price, which is very different. And I think what you're describing is something like the opposite, really. There is love seems to point towards the abundance mindset, and that with that come all these paradoxes, like the more you love, the more you love, or the more you love you give, the more you get, as though its sort of trajectory is actually one of expansion. And it's, you know, I love Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher. Its character is, rather than being economic, it would be aneconomic, you know, non-economic. There's nothing to do with give and take, parceling up, you know, the bar graph or the pie chart of what's available. It's the very nature of love to be expansive, you know, and perhaps that's where it connects again with your remarks about spiritual life, which, as I understand it, is exactly about that. It's always about expansiveness. There's no limit on expansiveness.
That's brilliant, and I like that an economic notion. And
Yeah,
I hadn't actually thought recently about the economy of scarcity or economy of abundance, or maybe I want to say the economy of scarcity and the an economy of
yeah,
abundance. But maybe it's a great link because you know, maybe that's how the ideas of love actually manifest in society as a whole. Because, you know, if
right,
there's a general myth that what matters most to us is scarce, then that is going to build a certain kind of, you might even say, consumptive economy,
exactly,
meaning that you've got to accumulate, you've got to secure, you've got to possess, and that satisfaction comes with the possession of more and more. Whereas an economy of abundance, I'm not even quite sure what that would look like.
right.
But I suppose it would be where quality mattered quite as much as quantity. And so there'd be I don't know, maybe there'd be a kind of vertical direction
Mm.
that somehow would show up rather than a sort of horizontal direction of accumulation.
That's so interesting. It makes me think of the world of dating and dating apps, where scarcity value seems to be exactly the operating measure. You know, there's the chances of meeting the one, you know, and partly because we have the language of meeting the one or the ideal person, seems to drive this idea of scarcity. And because we're so programmed to think of scarcity as value and vice versa, because we are fundamentally, aren't we? You know, we're Western capitalists. We can't help but having that as a kind of basal organization of the way we approach so many things, and that particularly, I think, in the dating world, which is a market. I mean, you know, if anything's a market, that is a market. People trying to pitch themselves and sell themselves and buy, consume profiles and what have you. I think it just reinforces that. So goodness knows how you would recast that. But you know, I think you must be right on that. You know, once you introduce the notion of scarcity, you're straight into the economic view of love, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of recasting, my suspicion is a bit like developmental growth, that it's actually through crisis, through suffering, that things get recast.
Mm.
And this is something which I keep returning to in discussions of love, because discussions of love can become very idealized or sentimental very quickly, as if all you need is love. I absolutely loathe that song. It's seen as such a terrible notion, in its very simplicity, and I mean that in the pejorative sense, as if love is this sort of flat thing that just washes over you, like the mother's arms, to give a nod to Freud's regression. But because I think that that love and suffering actually are much more closely tied together than it's comfortable really to admit. And it's the fuller love is always on the other side of suffering, and so the growth into love always, maybe in the first instance, you might say, presents us with pain and difficulty. And so maybe in the tradition of talking about love, I'm now thinking off the top of my head, but that's why these two things are so closely held together.
Yeah.
But the faith, almost, because in terms of direct awareness, you've always got to have the faith that there's something on the other side of the suffering, a sort of transcendent hope, is that it's a path worth following rather than a path that needs defending against. And again, maybe that takes us back a bit to scarcity and abundance.
Yeah, maybe it does. I also wondered if you thought, because obviously the connection between love and suffering is a central trope, if that's not too demeaning a way of putting it, in Christianity. That's the figure of Jesus Christ, presumably, among many other things that Jesus Christ represents. Do you think it applies to other religions as well? I mean, again, you'll know a lot more about this than I will, but there seems to be something about that conjunction of loving and suffering, which to me, perhaps wrongly, seems to produce also a notion of the sacred somehow.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it feels like it's part of a perennial philosophy. I mean, another obvious example would be in Buddhism, where the first noble truth is that life is suffering,
Exactly.
but there's a way through it.
Yeah.
It's quite clear that it's not saying the suffering just goes, but it's through the suffering that a wider life is discovered. So I wouldn't be surprised if that is actually a kind of perennial wisdom that shows up, and gets lost today, maybe because of the sense of the individual that is so powerful. And again, the modern isolated individual brings a lot of benefits with it, because it means that we value the individual, which means that all individuals matter, and so you get a much more equitable society. So that it's always complicated, I think, these things. It's never just like there's one clear path that is straight to heaven. That in this incarnate life, at least, to use another Christian motif, the cross is the way to more life.
I mean, we should probably wrap up in a second, Mark, but the way you've been thinking about it, lands with me a lot, because I've got a kind of emerging kind of three-part concept, I suppose. The first one is, your aversion to All You Need Is Love, that Beatles song, which I, of course, love, but we had to have some opposition in this, don't we? Which reminds me in turn of that phrase in Joyce's Ulysses. I think it's Leopold Bloom who voices it. I may have that wrong. And the phrase is love loves to love love. That, it becomes this self-involving, yes, potentially narcissistic, kind of warm, fuzzy, amniotic space, which I think All You Need Is Love is kind of trying to foster a bit, which is a bit probably too idealized and self-referring and possibly a bit regressive. So that's kind of phase one, if you like. Then there is phase two, which I think, you alluded to this earlier, which is about allowing for separation with others as well. You can be in relation and in love and loving, but without being completely interfused with the other. But then I think also, what I'm hearing, or maybe what I'm inferring from our conversation today, is maybe there is a third space, which is this more universal spiritual space, which isn't love loves to love love. It's not just sort of warm, fuzzy feelings, as it were. And in a way, it may not even be about feeling per se at all. I'd rather describe it as experience than affect, where we experience, that a much greater yeah, loss of self, but without loss of everything about us. Clearly, I need to work on this a bit more, but that's
Mhm.
sort of what's emerging for me in this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a vision of possibility rather than
Yeah,
something that I directly know.
yes,
But
exactly.
great figures like Dante have held it
Yeah.
out. So in Paradiso, he reaches this point where he suddenly realizes that he can't tell whether people are saying I or we anymore, and it's not one or the other. Somehow, the singular and the plural have become a kind of richer unity, and where neither is lost.
Mm,
I love that image, partly because it holds out a possibility that I'd love to know. But maybe just the last thought from me, even
yeah,
that
go on.
phrase, I'd love to know. I mean, I think that this is another reason why love feels like it confounds us as well as promises to us, because love can reach sort of over the horizon of our awareness in longing, in desire. But that very reaching over what we can quite articulate or reason or even prove is the sort of preparation for moving over that horizon, because it breaks us down a bit in
Mm,
order for a kind of wider reception, takes us out of ourself. And so, again, in spiritual traditions, I don't know, like the Cloud of Unknowing, and this great medieval Christian text, um,
mm,
that the author says quite explicitly that love will take you more further than reason into the divine, but you've got to be prepared for that love to exist in a cloud of unknowing. That's the kind of that's the deal in this mortal life, at least.
mm. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, well, look, thanks very much. I love that, and I think maybe even the spirit of love took us to places I didn't anticipate. So thank you.